All right, everyone, welcome to an episode of Apocalypsis Historia. I have Michael Martin, who goes by the same YouTube channel name. He is a writer, poet, and all-around great thinker, here to talk about maybe some John Dee, some Shakespeare, and maybe a host of other topics. Maybe it just depends on where we go. But yeah, Michael, thanks so much for joining us. How are you doing this evening?
Good, great, nice to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely. Yeah, so one of the first videos I saw of yours was about Edward Bernays and propaganda. And yeah, I on my channel, we talk about Shakespeare, we talk about, English Renaissance history, but I've dipped my toes into the MK Ultra, sphere. I've talked about Project Paperclip and Werner von Braun a lot on this channel before in the past. So yeah,
Mhm.
I'm ready to go all over the place, baby. But yeah, why don't you lead us off with like your background for our audience in case they're not aware of who you are?
Well, I have a pretty wide background. I started off as a musician and then left the music business when I was 26. Went to school, eventually ended up with a PhD in English Renaissance literature. I've written, I don't know, a bunch of books, but several books I wrote on Sophiology. And I also have a couple volumes of poetry out there and some literary criticism. And speaking of English Renaissance, I just happen to have it right here. You like showing books on live, right? This is actually was my dissertation. It's literature and the encounter with God in post-Reformation England. But the first chapter is about John Dee, as you just mentioned. So there's that. And I taught college for a while, but then the school I taught at, Marygrove College, abruptly closed in 2017. And so since then, I was kind of part of the gig economy. we have a biodynamic CSA here, a organic farm. So we do that, but I also work mostly as an editor, and I also have a Substack, The Druid Stares Back, if people are interested. A good place to follow what I do. But yeah, I grew up in Detroit, so I come from a working class background, um, and now I live in rural Jackson County, Michigan, Waterloo Township, Michigan, on a 10-acre farm, surrounded by woods.
Yeah, I'm jealous of that. So all around polymath, yeah, I love. I myself live on a little acre. My wife are trying to get the woods around us. We still got neighbors, yeah, but they're great. Yeah, we live on a little 1 acre. I've got some sheep. Or I'm sorry, sheep. I got some 2 goats and plenty of
Oh, dude,
chickens
really
right
good.
now. Yeah. And yeah, so yeah, you're kind of the inspiration. By day, you're doing the real work out there, getting the hands in the dirt. But by night, yeah, you're still doing the editing and keeping the brain sharp and all that stuff too. I've got my gaggle of kids, and I'm trying to upbring and maybe in the same sort of vein here. So yeah,
Yeah,
just look, hey, people are alive doing this stuff. I'm not crazy.
that's right. You're not crazy.
So yeah, yeah, that was great. So you said that this first chapter in your English dissertation on English Renaissance literature or whatever, first chapter's on D. You want to give us like a brief little glimpse of what that was about, or maybe how it folded into the rest of your
Well,
work?
I was interested in Dee's conversations with alleged angels, and I was interested in my dissertation about what happened like after the Reformation, and even more in the 17th century than when Dee was around, because of the Reformation, but because of also English civil wars and all these social tensions. There was this wild period of, you could call it, Protestant mysticism in England. And I did Dee, but also did John Donne and Sir Kenelm Digby, who was an alchemist and kind of a swashbuckler, but also Henry and Thomas Vaughan, and the metaphysical poet, and his brother, who was an Anglican priest and an alchemist. And I also did Jane Lead, who was the head of the Philadelphian Society. So, but I was interested in Dee because, you know, because I picked up years and years ago a copy of his what do they call it, a true and faithful relation of what passed between John Dee and some spirits, which was published long after he was dead. they found the manuscript in a trunk, in a false bottom of a trunk. And it's pretty fascinating. Dee and his assistant Edward Kelly communicating with what they thought were angels, but I'm convinced were not angels. I mean, if they weren't demons, they were at least spirits who were effing with them. Over a long period of time. And Dee seems like a nice guy. I mean, he doesn't seem like a, I think he had intentions in the right direction.
Not
but I
this
think
kind of Aleister Crowley vibe or something,
No, he's not like Crowley
Right.
was Crowley as what's his Colin Wilson called Aleister Crowley. He was the biggest bastard of them all. But you don't get that from John Dee. You get the sense that he was very scholarly and very dedicated family man kind of guy, but also probably the most gifted intellectual polymath in England at the time. He was a counselor with Queen Elizabeth, but he just got played by these spirits. And I tell people, it's like, you want to mess around with a Ouija board. It's like dialing 7 numbers on a phone or 9, 10 numbers on a phone and going, yeah, can I talk to Jesus? And the spirits are like, yeah. Oh, it's Jesus, right? So, and that's what when you do stuff like the scrying he was doing, you're asking for trouble because it does work.
Do you think that I had a discussion with someone in the comments of that video I was referenced at the top because I mentioned Enochian, and I've like poked fun at just the funniness because it's I just point out this sort of fun pun that Enochian is supposed to be the language of the angels, and yet it's found by this English guy. Just I don't know. It's kind of just fun to look at that stuff.
I think people make a big deal about that too. I mean, some occultist types, but it never went anywhere. Where he's getting, and he really didn't. The reason he wanted to find the language of Adam, which is what he thought Enochian was going to be, right? He wanted to do that because he thought that would reverse the kind of Tower of Babel vibes that were actually happening with the Reformation, when Christendom itself was broken into many, many different theological languages, kind of like what happened with the Tower of Babel in the Bible, where it's all divided because they're. And he should have known, because what he was trying to do is climb the mountain or climb the ziggurat to speak to God, and he got the same thing happened with him that happened with the Tower of Babel. It entered in ruins.
Yeah, wow, that's a great parallel, actually. Yeah, it's kind of interesting because, well, that person in the comments was saying that, yeah, they've only heard or only ever, anyone that they've known that has, quote-unquote, worked with Enochian magic, it just seemed to go poorly, Something about it just seemed tainted,
It's bad news. I mean, it's, I've never done it, but I've read everything about it, and in the spirit, certainly I read everything Dee ever wrote, and people wrote about Dee. and he just ended miserably. He basically pimped out his wife at the at the command of these spirits, who told him to transgress one of the commandments, and he was freaked out about it. He said, "I can't do that. That's against one of the commandments." And he's like, "Well, I'm coming from God, and I tell you to break the commandment. That's how it goes." So I assume the spirits were preying on his vanity and his secret desires, his fantasies that he wouldn't let anybody know. They were preying on it, but they were also showing it to him and said, "Yeah, you're supposed to do this. You were elected by God." I was? Oh, okay. Yeah. And it's a sad, I mean, it really is a cautionary tale what happened with John Dee.
I maybe it was from Esoterica, another YouTube channel, that they had some. Maybe it's from that book. I'm not sure, but when Kelly and Dee like summon some spirit, and the spirit's like, "Yes, I'll tell you like the secrets of the universe and all this stuff." And I think Kelly or one of them was like, "That's all great, but do you know where the treasure is?" Like,
that was what they used to do. Actually, a lot of people who would do scrying, that's what they would use it for, like to find buried treasure, and it would work. It works sometimes.
I've heard, the water, the water tuning, or I forget how that works.
Yeah,
with stuff like that.
The willow wands.
Yes.
Yeah, and it works sometimes. Sometimes, usually it doesn't work, but sometimes it does. And I think the other thing you see with Edward Kelly in those transactions with the spirits is he cut out. He's like, I'm not doing this anymore. This is evil, and he left for 6 months or a year, and then he showed up again, and he was, in fact, he was Dee's medium, so he kind of checked out for a while. He said, I can't do this, as evil. And then finally he came back. Who knows why? And there's all kinds of suspicion that maybe he was a double agent, and because Dee was working with the Queen, but Burley didn't trust, you know what I mean? All kinds of nefarious espionage kinds of conspiracy theory kind of stuff going on in that whole situation. Nevertheless, we know he was called upon often by Queen Elizabeth for astrological consultations and other kinds of advice,
Yeah, and I'd love to bring up another point in regares to that. Cut real quick here. If my buddy Chance just showed up, so I'll just introduce you real quick.
Nice to meet you.
It's my friend.
Nice to meet you, Michael.
You have a nice John D type beard too, by the way.
Thank you. I've been cultivating it ever since we got in touch with John Michael Greer.
Oh yeah,
it's
You're catching up.
Yeah, I'm trying to cultivate my own sort of beardly mass here and give myself a sense of ethos because of it. But thank you for noting that. I've also got my my Goya T-shirt on,
and I salute you for it. There you go.
So thank you for letting us get to talk with you and get to sort of pick your brain because you are a whole magnitude more popular than we are. For every one person that knows who we are, there are 10 people who know who you are. And so thank you for spending time on small fries like us. But it's awesome to get to talk about this.
Yeah.
It's awesome to get to talk about this deep cut kind of knowledge going back to the Renaissance. I know your sort of expertise is specifically a little more late 16th century, but because of your John Dee stuff, you do dive back into Elizabethan sort of Shakespearean times, and that's sort of where I'm focused. But Brady will go anytime, anywhere, any space to talk about black magic or propaganda, so you were just absolutely right up all three of our alleys. So just wanted to introduce myself and say thanks, and I don't want to derail this anymore, so Brady, take back over.
And so in regards to we're kind of on this D tangent here, and you brought up the astrological thing because another tidbit that we had found in regards to our channel, another one of the hallmarks that Chances sort of brought to my attention, which kind of was the impetus for kind of starting our channel, was Sir Philip Sidney. And he was just a guy that he was, was like, hey, this is, some pretty good literature. This is some pretty good stuff.
Oh, yeah. Is that the Astrophil and Stella? Is that what that is?
Yeah, I got mine right here.
It's one of my favorite sequences of poems ever.
Yeah. And I was never a poetry guy until Chance was sort of like, hey, go check this stuff out. And I was like, I really like this. Yeah, this is interesting.
It's really good.
We've been sort of focused on Philip Sidney. We have several videos breaking down his defense of poesy. I have a whole thing where I compare his article with Tolkien's article on fairies and how they're pretty similar, and they're both Oxford graduates and stuff like that, right? But one of the things that I was always interested. We do a lot of Shakespeare authorship. I won't put you on the spot for a question like that yet.
You can,
but
you got opinions.
Yeah. But one of the little interesting things that I had found later on is, I don't know if you're familiar with Alan Green. He's all into this Shakespeare code stuff and, mathematics and the sonnets. We won't go into that now.
The Bacon Code,
Yeah, well, he was saying that John Dee is somewhere involved in Shakespeare, right? And I never figured John Dee as like a writer, maybe as like a consultant figurehead or something.
So. No, I do think Prospero is in part based on John Dee.
Right.
In part, not entirely.
But one of the interesting.
But I think with Prospero, not to cut you off, with Prospero, he's kind of a John Dee figure because what happens to him? He gets screwed over, right?
Yep.
And so he's kind of a tragic figure.
Yeah.
But one of the. I was always interested in seeing how close you could get to someone involved with such and such circle or whatever, right? But I didn't realize how closely tied actually Philip Sidney's family is with John Dee, and like John Dee's his like personal mentor and sort of teacher for a while. And one of the things that really perked my attention is that I found way back in the footnote in a John Dee book is that he also apparently predicted to the T Philip Sidney's death, and that he was like, you'll probably die around this time, you'll probably die about this particular method, blah blah blah.
That I didn't know about that, but I'm not surprised. He was a good astrologer for sure.
Right. And so that's what we've talked to John Michael Greer about, his expertise in astrology, and since he knows D as well, and he's like, can you help us make sense of this? Apparently this is the only D chart that he's aware of is in existence. So I was like, well, that's pretty cool. It's not only did he successfully predict the Queen's successful sort of reign, right?
Yeah.
But also he killed Philip Sidney. I jest, but I didn't know if you had any comment on any of that prediction stuff that D was known for.
Well, he was. I mean, I think like John Michael, he was a really capable astrologer. And the thing is, I mean, I'm a pretty decent astrologer, but the thing is with astrology, well, he was not good at predicting for himself, was he? But the thing with astrology is, it's you always know something's going to happen during a certain kind of transit, but you never know what. Like for instance, there was how long ago? 4 years ago, 5 years ago, 4 years ago. I had in my chart, I have a T square, and part of that square is Saturn square the sun and the moon. I was born on the new moon, so. But at that in Taurus, and then that's when Uranus hit between 7 and 12 degrees of Taurus, and it was also my second Saturn return at the same time. So Saturn was in Aquarius, and there was a lot of stuff going on. It wasn't just my chart; it was like the whole world was having weird shit go down. But what happened with me? I assumed it would be about my mother dying, because my mother had been living with us for 7 years, 6 years, and she had dementia and she was not well. And I thought when Uranus hits there and Saturn squaring, that'll probably be when my mom dies. But it wasn't. What happened? My wife got cancer of the endometrial lining at the exact time, right? So I was right. It had something to do with women in my life, but I got the wrong woman because I assumed I didn't assume it was going to be my wife. I assumed it would be my mother because she was sick already, right? So that's the problem with prediction. You always know something's going to happen. You never know exactly what. At least in my experience, maybe a better astrologer could do a better job.
That's such a Shakespeare prophecy twisted thing. It's like, oh, you think you got it all figured out, and it's like, oh, they flipped the script on you like the last second. You're like, oh, that was
and the problem with that, it wasn't that it was my presupposition of what it would be. Like, oh yeah, it's going to be my mom because I was being logical, but there was nothing there that said it would be only my mom. It was certainly the mother of my children, though. Right. So that's the problem with astrology. You always know something, and that's the way you learn astrology. I don't know if you guys practice astrology much, but the way I learned was not so much from reading books about astrology, but just having ideas what the different transits and aspects meant, and just seeing what happened when a transit moved someplace. And you go, okay, and you kind of write, you kind of make a mental note. So when Jupiter hits the ascendant, that's usually a pretty good thing, or it's the midheaven, also a pretty good thing. But it's with Jupiter, it's never as good as you think it's going to be, or as you wish it would be, but it's always good. So you think Jupiter hits the midheaven, I'm good. That'll mean I'll get a new career, which doesn't just means you get, like a bonus. It's nice, but it's not as nice. And the thing is with the bad aspects, it's always worse than you think. You know what I mean?
That's funny. All right. Yeah, thanks for that take. And well, yeah, to go back to to go back to the video for just a second and some of the topics you brought up, because we're still on this John D vein, you also brought up Giodarno Bruno. And some of the stuff that I think I quoted here from this video were that you talked about Giodarno's philosophy about controlling like individuals and crowds, essentially, if I maybe quoted you correctly there. And this idea of eros.
Well, that was him, but it's also, you see it in L.F.S. Levy in Transcendental Magic, or Doctrine and Ritual of High Magic. You also see it, well, to a degree, it's more vague in Plotinus. And that's how propaganda works, right? And if it was interesting to me, so about a year and a half ago, I was invited to give a lecture on magic at a conference in Hillsdale, Michigan, with all these Hillsdale college professors there, right? And I said, okay, yeah, cool, I'll do that. And I know a lot about it anyway, but I figured I would go into magic and propaganda because I was really seeing a lot over COVID and stuff, how magical techniques were being used at a mass scale for mass hysteria, for mass control. So one of the things that Plotinus says and Levy says, and I think Bruno says as well, is that magic works best on a person of a nervous disposition, right? Or people in a state of anxiety. And what did all the stuff that they were doing over COVID do to mass numbers of people? It made them all anxious, right? What the hell? When they tell you 2 weeks to flatten the curve, and it's like 30 days later and they still haven't let anybody out of the box, and then it goes to a year, right? So people lived in this constant state of uncertainty. And when you do that, that's when you hit them with the part of magic that is. So first you got to prepare the ground, right? It's like gardening. So first you have to prepare the ground, and prepare the ground by making everybody nervous wrecks. And then you hit them with two things that in magic work. And it's not fumigations, it's not wands, it's not swords. It's word and image. So what did they do right away with the whole COVID thing? Build back better, the new normal. And they kept hitting, and it wasn't just the American government, it was governments all over the world, especially the West. They were banging on those, and they had the images to accompany it, the images of the mask, the images of all the other things, right? And so many people live streaming their COVID shots, right? So those were all examples of a magical operation. It had all the same things, and it worked like it worked like a charm.
Yeah, you can't get away from some of that vernacular, can you?
No, but to me, having I'm not a practicing magician or anything, but having studied these things for most of my adult life, and certainly at a graduate doctoral level, it's not hard to predict. And then you read Edward Bernays' book Propaganda, which is right in front of you there, and in the first sentence, basically, he's telling you, yeah, this is how it works. We give the people the illusion of democracy because we're really running things, and he talks about the engineering of consent and the invisible government, right? So and maybe. And I don't, I haven't seen anything that Dee said this, but I think Dee's idea of the British Empire, which he gave birth to, it's partially a magical operation, and I think there's an argument to be made, and I think John Michael just made one. I think he did. Maybe I'm thinking about somebody else, about the British government to this day still running basically a magical operation on the world that's connected to the money system, right?
I mean, yeah, English is kind of like the international language too, right? They managed to successfully export, that's kind of mental software, if we could put a term to it,
Yeah. Yep.
And yeah, as far as that magic vernacular, it's, the same reason why grammar or grimoire and glamour are all, sort of etymologically connected, and all that sort of fun takes. And when you talked about, making people nervous wrecks, and when you talked about making the bed, what was one of the things, a famous movie that kind of came out before all that COVID stuff that now people in hindsight are like, well, yeah, look at that, is the Contagion film. I don't know if you're aware with that, with, Matt
I'm aware of it. I
Damon.
don't think I've seen it, but yeah, I know the drill, right?
And yeah,
And
not,
yeah, I mean,
oh, yeah,
stuff
go
like
ahead.
that's all over the place, right?
Oh, wait, say it again?
No, stuff like that's all over the place, where they kind of what they call predictive programming, right?
Yeah.
Where they give you a template to get into the imagination, and that's where it works, in the imagination, right?
And so where I'm trying to work you into a corner here is that, okay, yeah, so we understand now today that media can kind of have these subconscious effects, or maybe people in the know that, right, are people not going to get charmed or spellbound. But do you think we see any of this sort of stuff? Because once again, Giodarno Bruno is pretty good friends with Philip Sidney. Just so happens that they have a lot of philosophical discussions together and the like. One of them dedicates a thing to another. I want to say, I can't remember. Yeah.
Bruno dedicates her heroic furies to Sydney.
Oh well, yeah, dude. Oh my gosh, I forget how on the nose some of this stuff is. Okay, but do you think we see, with just some of this stuff in mind, I'm not saying that Giodarno Bruno is a part of Shakespeare, but do you think we see any of that sort of media
He's a
play in
character.
Shakespeare?
He's a character in Love's Labor is Lost.
Okay, yeah, right.
They call him Barone there, right? And it's a kind of shorthand for Bruno.
Absolutely.
And do you think that there's any of this sort of media magic happening in Shakespeare? Not to say you have to put judgment on it, but do you think that that there's any of this sort of laying the bed, so to speak, involved
like
with the
propaganda
plays?
kind of stuff?
And maybe we could even say there's such a thing as like white propaganda, right? I've seen people say that.
I think so. Shakespeare dealt in the imagination, right? And any good writer is, working with the imagination, and that is, in a way, it's a good thing, which is why William Blake called it Jesus the imagination, right? But so it goes both ways, and I think what we're seeing right now in our culture, in Western culture, not just American culture, is it's mostly going in one way, because people don't have they have atrophied imaginations, because their imaginations have been atrophied because they don't have to work to create anything. So, for instance, do I have it here? Yes, I do. Let me pull out Henry V, Part 1. Where'd it go? Henry V. Henry V, there you go. In the prologue. It's an exercise in magic. Because here's what, I'm just going to read it to you. I can recite it from memory, but I don't want to blow it because I've been working all day. Right? Oh, for the muse of fire that would ascend the brightest heaven of invention. A kingdom for a stage, princes to act, and monarchs to behold the swelling scene. Then should the warlike Harry, like himself, assume the port of Mars, and at his heels leashed in like hounds, should famine, sword, and fire crouch for employment. Right? Great opening. But then he says, but pardon, gentles all, the flat, unraised spirits that hath dared on this unworthy scaffold, meaning the stage, to bring forth so great an object. Can this cockpit hold the vasty fields of France? Or may we cram within this wooden O the very casks that affright the air at Agincourt? Oh, pardon, since the crooked figure may attest in the little place a million, and let us ciphers to this great account on your imaginary forces work. Right? This is magic. Think when we talk of horses that you see them printing their proud hoofs of the receiving earth. Right? For it is your thoughts that now must deck our kings. Right? Right?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah.
All the piece out our imperfections with your thoughts. Right? So he's saying, this is what magic is. And he knows this because he does the same thing in Midsummer Night's Dream, right? The poet, the lover, and the madman are of all imagination compact, right? And then he does the same thing in The Tempest. And he does it with Owen Glendower in Henry IV Part 1, and he does it in Macbeth, right? Macbeth is, talk about a cautionary tale, right? Because what happens with Macbeth's problem is and this is how demons work. They don't lie. They only tell you enough truth for you to start believing it and follow. What happens, it's not that they're lying to you, but you're projecting your own desires onto the little piece of truth they told you. And they're not saying, not like that. They go, oh yeah. Right? That's how it works. So there's the Shakespeare, the good imagination, right? But there's also the wicked use of imagination, and everything. In a way, you could say everything is a magical operation, right? William Blake never talks about the evil parts of the imagination, always about the good parts. But I think the problem is because we have such atrophied imaginations in the Western world because of the internet and movies and stuff, because our children aren't raised playing imaginative games anymore, but they're raised on tablets, right? So, which gives you images ready-made, right? So they don't have to work. There's no work for the imagination to do. It's already served up to them. So they're you could say, comparing it to physical fitness, their imaginative muscles are flabby and not up to the task, right? They're out of shape. Whereas until the advent of certainly the 20th century with mass media, whether it's movies or radio or whatever, children had much more reliance on their imaginations. And think about Shakespeare, right? One of the things when you teach Shakespeare that you realize that the students can't read it and they're kind of dumb and they can't handle it. And then you tell them, no, this was popular entertainment in the 50s, 90s, and most of the audience was illiterate. Okay. I think at the time of Shakespeare, I think it's like 17% of the male population was literate. That's not much. And yet he was making bank selling tickets to illiterate people to come and see the plays, right?
And so, just to wrap up that question, so Shakespeare is definitely aware of magic, and obviously our culture is so different than it was back in Renaissance England. Everyone's just much more ensconced in astrology and yada yada. But where I was sort of insinuating that obviously contagia, bad propaganda. Shakespeare, does it get a thumbs up approval of
I think for Shakespeare, I think with Henry V, that's where I was going, and I got derailed. Henry V, I think, is nationalistic propaganda, right? Most of his plays aren't, though, but that one certainly is. Right?
It's too funny. Brady and I were having a long-winded discussion today on the telephone in sort of preparation for this, and I've been pitching lately as a sort of devil's advocate because I am one that wants to believe that Shakespeare is largely some kind of propagandic effort, but because I've been diving more and more into the history of the theaters, it's becoming a more complex question where I have to ask myself, okay, is this whole theatrical endeavor some propagandic thing, or is Shakespeare isolated within it? And I've been wrestling with that, but I was saying to Brady that, it may not be as openly propagandic as we want to believe, that, a lot of this is going to the rabble. It's not going to big, important people like, say, certain select plays are. But then I was noting that, like, if there's one play, though, that, like, has to be propaganda, it's Henry V.
Oh, yeah.
That it's just such
it's like a war film. It's like those World War II
Saving Private
movies,
Ryan
right?
of its time, right?
Yeah, exactly. The thing is, Shakespeare was not there to spread truth, beauty, and goodness. He was there to make money, right? So when he did Henry V, and he did Twelfth Night at Royal Command. He did the Merry Wives of Windsor also at Royal Command, So, but he found a way to make a buck and stay in business. And he actually, and I'm one of those people who thinks I don't think he was necessarily a practicing Catholic, but he certainly came from a Catholic background.
Yeah, we've said
And it's
Catholic
interesting.
sympathetic.
You compare Shakespeare, his presentation of Catholic characters like monks in particular, and he's never in a state of condemnation. They're not the stock villains. Where if you see in Faust by Christopher Marlowe, when Mephistopheles shows up on stage after he shows up in the habit of a Franciscan friar, because he's kind of a stock villain costume, right, for Protestant England. But Shakespeare never did that. He might be more ambivalent, like Friar Lawrence in Romeo and Juliet. He's not evil, but he gets the kids in a lot of trouble, not unintentionally. So Shakespeare is really kind of an interesting figure about that goes. But what I was going to say kind of goes both ways, political cooperation. So one place where I've argued with people about this, and I'm right, is in Macbeth, right? Which is the first play Shakespeare wrote after King James came to the throne, who was from Scotland, which is just like, that would be like having a Canadian president. You know what I mean? So James is from Scotland, and he wrote a book, Demonology, and he thinks he's an expert theologian, right? He's an expert on witches and stuff. And then Shakespeare puts Macbeth on the stage, which does two things. First of all, one of the threads of it, if you want to think in terms of nationalistic propaganda, it validates James's claim to the throne,
Right.
through the line of Banquo, right? But on the other hand, it validates James's claim to the throne by witches.
Exactly. That's exactly what I've been saying. Thank you.
Yeah. So I can imagine James sitting there in the audience going, yeah, that's cool. They think I'm, wait a minute. You know what I mean? That's always been my take on that play.
Thank you. Oh my God, I'm just like relieved I've heard someone else actually repeat that, because I have this whole video about the word weird and why it changes sort of definition because of this new meme in the Shakespeare play. I won't tangent off into that now, but yeah, that's why I was like, hey, this is kind of like a bizarre aspect. It's just, I don't know, it's kind of ironic.
It's a weird play in that way. I mean, it's a dark play, but it's, just think of it politically, like, man, James must have been squirming in his seat in the theater.
Well, and this is something that so I'm a high school teacher and an English teacher, and I get to shove Macbeth in front of my students' faces, and I make them read about an act of Spark Notes, and then I give that up and I show them a film version, because that's about
Which film version do you show?
Honestly, the one that I found to be the most successful, because I've tried several, is the 2015 one by Justin. I forget his name, but it's the one starring Michael Fassbender and Marion Cotillard.
Yeah, I haven't seen that one.
That one, it's a little more liberal with it changes some moments and some scenes, and it maybe takes a lot out. It streamlines it a lot, but I find for my high school students that's pretty helpful. And what I do love about that movie is that it sets in actual medieval Scotland, and it tries really hard to bring about that Heath-like atmosphere. And that's something that I think, like, just musically, sonically, listening to Scottish actors do Macbeth over RP actors, it's so much better. There's all these R's in it, laugh to scorn and all that. And you don't get that with all that RP acting stuff. So I personally, just going to throw that out there, I'm a huge Coen Brothers fan, but I personally hate that version.
I didn't see that version.
Don't ever waste your time. Don't ever, if you think that there's something to go into and look into, go for it. But honestly, just don't waste your time. That said, what I was bringing up about this Macbeth film is that when I show these students, I always have to lay out the witch's prophecy for them, and it's sort of this puzzle that they get to follow throughout the story, and that's what makes it accessible for these, early noob rookie kids that can't read for anything. And when we're doing all that, we go through and we see, okay, ding, 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 this prophecy came true. Ding, 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 this prophecy came true. Ding, ding, ding. The only prophecy that you never see come true is Banquo's line coming to the throne. That's never actually dramaturgically within the play. That's just after the fact
All you get is the
external
show of
fact.
kings. That's all you get is the show of kings.
Yeah. And so it's one of these weird contexts that, like, for us, it maybe reads a little different because we don't get to see it. So we maybe get to ask ourselves, oh, were the witches right or not? Because us dumb Americans don't know who Banquo is from King James. But people in Shakespeare's time, there's almost a flip side reading where as soon as they hear that, it validates every prophecy that the witches have given, because that's undoubtedly true.
Because the other prophecies don't come till later, right? With the Burnham Wood, right?
Right.
And when you can imagine, with the Shakespeare's audience watching the show of Kings, and they must be going, "Oh, fuck," you know what I mean?
Right. And
the thing is, they had much richer imaginations, so they could enter into that much more real way than we can.
Right.
Yeah.
I like that take. And there's something especially Sphinxian or Greek even about the second set of prophecies versus the first set, and I think that sort of I will dive into it for a second, even though Brady doesn't want to. Brady's whole research on the word weird was just that previous to Shakespeare, up into Chaucer and even the 1500s, the word weird, it means the Norns, it means the fates, it means the guiding path of time or what will happen. It's related to the old English erd, and so that's what it means. And then after Shakespeare, it clearly means strange, off-putting, bizarre, grotesque, and there's really one single crux and place in history where we can trace where the word kind of means both, and that is in Macbeth. And a lot of people have actually, I guess historically in Shakespeare attribution studies, have sort of pinpointed that weird, bizarre relationship over the play, and they have suggested, this is one of the plays where Thomas Middleton is actually putting interpolations and additions, maybe even to the point of co-writing with Shakespeare in Shakespeare's later career.
Well, and it's a weird thing because the text they have is corrupted, and it's super short compared to all the other plays, right?
Right. And so classical scholars from the 1800s or early 1900s kind of poo-pooed Macbeth and kind of put down these additions by Middleton because Middleton was ruining Shakespeare's sort of classical vision of what fate was. That the real Shakespeare was giving these fates these actual sort of supernatural, angelic, monstrous kind of abilities, demon-like abilities even. Whereas this Middletonian interpolation started taking that and kind of undercutting it and satirizing it to the point of materializing it and turning it into the mundane, and these witches are just silly old ladies singing to Hecate and trying to get with sailors, and these classical scholars don't like that, and it's a bad thing. But I've just was always trying to push, and I've been arguing and trying to push to Brady.
They were victims of the Whig narrative too, right?
Right.
And Shakespeare was not part of that. I mean, that's another reason I think he's Catholic country boy, is because, in Merry Wives of Windsor with the whole bit with her and the hunter, which is hilarious, right? But also the Midsummer Night's Dream and all the stuff with throughout the plays with ghosts and fairies and stuff, and Owen Glendower. I mean, look at Henry IV Part 1, right? Owen Glendower and Hotspur's all on his case when he says, "I can call spirits from the vasty deep." Well, so can I. But will they come when you do call them, right? But who dies?
Yeah,
Hotspur,
right.
The rationalist dies, right? And I think through, and that's why I think Shakespeare, it's part of what Keats called negative capability, right? He doesn't tell you what to think. He gives you indications, right? But it's not his business is not to, he's not didactic. He's an entertainer, and he's entertaining himself.
Right.
He's entertaining himself. I don't know if you know this, but on my Substack for the last month or so, on Sundays I'll throw up a folk song, and I threw up one or two. I'm going to do another one of songs I wrote to Shakespeare's tunes, because when I was a Waldorf teacher, I would direct kids in plays. We did Midsummer Night's Dream and Tempest, and also did Twelfth Night, and I wrote tunes for all the songs in the plays. And
Cool.
what you realize what Shakespeare was doing, like in Twelfth Night, for instance, there's all these great songs. And the reason there's all these great songs in Twilight is because all of a sudden he had a comedian who didn't just do broad comedy like Will Kemp, who played Sir Toby Belch and probably played Bottom, but he had Robert Armin, who was more of an intellectual comedian, but also had a great voice. So Shakespeare's like, let's put lots of songs in this song. Let's play, right?
Right.
So he would work with the people he had. You know what I mean? He didn't write the plays. I'm writing a play, and now I should find the people. He had the people, and he wrote the play for those people.
Right.
And then, but the thing is, he was not trying to, like producers now or directors now, making a statement.
Right.
He was not making a statement. He was, he was putting on a not really P.T. Barnum-esque, but he was putting on a show for people. But he wanted to make it enriching for himself as well. Because you could say that Marlowe, for instance, I think Marlowe is an inferior playwright compared to Shakespeare, even though Shakespeare was intimidated by him when they started out, because Marlowe's got an agenda, right? Shakespeare doesn't have an agenda necessarily. I think he's a trickster, like when he throws that stuff in with Macbeth about James, but I don't think it's an agenda. I think it's like telling jokes with him.
Yeah.
Right? But also to explore the depth of the human experience.
Yeah.
Which is why he's so different than anybody else from his era.
Absolutely. I like that reading personally too. I like the idea of Shakespeare sort of as the existentialist nihilist of his era. That he is in contrast to someone like Ben Jonson, who is openly didactic, right? Like somebody who's trying to shove a moral,
right,
Trojan horse a moral down into the populace. And that's where it does get hazy for me, trying to weave through what kind of propaganda Shakespeare is, because it's not so openly clear like a Ben Jonson thing where we have some clear agenda being pushed. It's something a little deeper and somebody could say more insidious, but it's hard to pinpoint exactly or prove exactly that, this is propaganda,
right.
But that's, I guess, for you, good black magic, right?
Yeah, and I think I love Ben Jonson. He is funny, but
agreed.
Like he's super funny. You know who I think his reincarnation is?
Who's that?
David Bentley Hart.
Okay, I'll have to look into that.
Oh, David Bentley Hart certainly is a reincarnation of Ben Jonson, because he's a polemicist, but he's really funny about it.
Okay.
Right?
I've said the Alchemist is the funniest play of the era, like bar none. It is the funniest.
I thought so too until I saw who wrote it. Francis Beaumont and Fletcher. The Night of the Burning Pestle. Have you ever read that one?
That's like.
I saw it perform once. I've never laughed so hard in my life.
It's hilarious because it's an inside joke around here that I've said that I must have to see this play because every time I've tried to read it, I get so annoyed at Rafe's parents interrupting the goddamn play. Excuse my French.
Well, that's what was so
funny. But
that's
the joke, right?
Well, because Rafe's parents are in the audience and they keep breaking it. And the thing, when I went to see it, I saw it at the Folger Shakespeare Library, 20 years ago, maybe more.
Oh, wow.
And Rafe's parents were in the audience and they were kind of planted. You didn't know it until they walked out. Can you put our lad in here? This is not good, right? So but it is. It's also didactic in the way it's commenting on the influence of the burgeoning middle class in England. But my God, the songs were so fun. In fact, in the production I saw, they didn't use the traditional songs that they stuck in, like "Hit the Road Jack" and stuff like that. Which, and of course, when Rafe comes out with his shield and the burning pestle on his shield, and it looks like an inflamed penis from venereal disease. It's probably the hardest I've ever laughed at any moment in theater history.
Touche. If nothing else, this interview is gonna totally reframe my outlook on that specific play, because
it's a hard one to read. It's a hard one to read.
It is. I disliked it so much that I didn't touch Fletcher or Beaumont for a good year after that, and then I came across A King and No King and read that, and I was like, oh, this is wonderful. It must be all Fletcher and none of that hack Beaumont. And then I looked into Cyrus Hoy, and he was like, no, that's actually pretty much all Beaumont. And I was like, oh, he's really good. This is awesome. And so since then, I've read several of their plays, but I haven't gone back and retouched.
But to see it performed live is the only way to see that, okay. I think. Because I've also tried to read it a bunch of times. Like, it's not as fun as the one I saw live.
Okay, that makes me feel better. And we have a friend that's a real big kind of Shakespeare, Mary Sidney scholar, and he swears the same thing about Pericles and Cymbeline, that you go and read those Shakespeare plays and they seem just totally inferior to.
Pericles is one of my favorite plays.
And he swears you go see it and it's the best Shakespeare play you can go see.
It is. Not a dry eye in the house of those recognition scenes.
That's exactly what he said, dude. That's exactly what he said.
I am not kidding.
I have another friend that's a very, very big Broadway theater fan, and he swears that, oh, no, seeing the play is just better than reading, and I'm Mr. Book Literature guy, and I swear that reading is better than seeing, and, it just seems like there are some plays where my buddy Ian is right, and I'm definitely wrong, that, just go watch Pericles, or go watch Cymbeline, or, Night of the Burning Pestle. You can't read it. You're missing it. You're missing too much of the meta theatrical experience.
Well, you got plus you have to understand. I mean, as we all understand, those things were published kind of like a souvenir that for people who had already seen the play. I got to get a copy of that to have at home. I'm gonna this will help me remember that great time I had. Right.
And it reminds me of I came across some literature that was saying that the book covers or the title pages of these plays, they're not really modeled to be specifically book covers. What they are is they're brochures or pamphlets or posters to market for these plays. And so those would be printed in mass and sent to the publisher.
And cheaply, yeah.
And so they could post it up and for all that. Mm-hmm. And that maybe gives a different reading or context in this whole idea of Shakespeare on the title page.
Yeah, it's no good. And I'm not kidding. So once in a while I teach an online Shakespeare course. I taught Shakespeare for years in college. And
wow, okay.
That Pericles is the one that always kills people. They're like, because the thing is with Pericles, the first 2.5 was not really written by Shakespeare. I can't remember who it was written by.
Right, it's George Wilkins.
George Wilkins. And then when Shakespeare shows up, all of a sudden the lights go on in the house. Well, like when they get to Mitylene, right? With the prostitutes and stuff. It's hilarious. And there's so many great, but then he goes from the ridiculous to sublime, right? Those crazy VD jokes, to this recognition scene between Pericles and Marina, and then between Thaisa and her family, and Shakespeare just does that. I mean, he just takes those recognition scenes and draws them out, like the one at in Twelfth Night with Sebastian and Viola. I mean, he could have made that like a 5-minute scene, but nope. You are my, he could have gone, yeah, you're my sister, great, and then no. I'm going to milk this and squeeze the audience for every emotional molecule they have left, and it's so beautiful. And you don't want it to end. That's how he's brilliant. Because you don't want that thing to end. You don't want that recognition scene to end. So he draws it on as long as he can.
Right.
Talk about willing suspension of disbelief, right?
That's excellent. I love that take. It reminds me of some of the it's not a critique of Dr. Johnson, but Samuel Johnson had all these, some of them were outright critiques and complaints about Shakespeare, but then he had all these other kind of comments that seem offhanded, but then it's like, wait, no, this is actually a really big compliment. And I think he literally says that exact thing, that we have these resolutions that get so tied up with a bow that, you know, it seems absurd, but you don't want it to end. I want to say Dr. Johnson says the same
I mean,
kind
yeah,
of
I
thing.
mean, how dumb is it that they're going to get married at first sight that day, right? But we want that to be, I mean, but I think that bespeaks a metaphysical reality,
Right.
you know? And I was thinking about this today because the song I'm going to record on Sunday for my Substack is Oh Mistress Mine from 12th Night.
Okay.
And all those Carpe Diem songs, you know, youth's the stuff will not endure, you know? And I think that's actually so relevant to our moment right now culturally, where young people are not having children, right? They're getting married late and not having kids. And then, I mean, talk about demographic winter. I mean, what's the point? You know, and Shakespeare's time got that right? You know, in fact, that's the whole theme. One of the themes of this in the sonnets to the young man is like, dude, quit playing around. You have to leave the world a copy, at least.
Right.
You can't go on. Youth is stuff that will not endure.
Right.
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 And that's what all the comedies that end in marriages that are in absurd terms, right? Nothing close to reality. But to me, the more and more, and I've been reading Shakespeare for years, the more older I get, and I'm getting older, you know, this message in Shakespeare about why we're here, which you see in the comedies about marriage and procreation, and which is all through Elizabethan literature, right?
Right.
It's the problem with Astrophil and Stella, right? You know, his frustration at not being, and the poor Philip Sidney died at 32, didn't have no children, right?
One daughter.
Did he have one? Okay.
Yep.
Well, I mean, his nephews are the ones that the Shakespeare Folio is dedicated to.
Well, that Sidney Herbert family, man, they were something else, right? His sister, Mary, wow, she was actually, I can't remember, like aunt or something to George Herbert.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
And you know about, I mean, I don't want to, but Philip Sidney is so responsible for not Shakespeare, but certainly for the metaphysical poets.
Yeah. Done.
Because without the Sidney Salter, I don't think that would have happened. Between the Sidney Salter and John Donne, they got married and gave birth to the rest of the metaphysical poets.
Yep.
I had found out that apparently Sidney actually stayed with the Dunn family when he was like in elementary school. So yeah, he actually like floated in. There's actually some little bit of connection.
Interesting, because they were Catholic.
Yeah.
Well, and to that end, it's like Philip's such a champion of Protestantism, but him and Mary are named after, you know, King Philip and Queen Mary, you know?
Yeah.
And so as much as, you know,
Campion sort of sympathies too,
yeah,
and stuff like that.
And so like as much as they're, you know, beholden to this sense of Protestantism, I do think that that's a little bit of a political posture for their uncle.
Too.
And
I think it's nationalistic is what it is.
Yeah, exactly. It's more trying to syncretize different beliefs into a sense of nationality.
Yeah. And I think Dee himself, I think there's a pretty good case to be made that he was a Catholic priest.
Interesting.
You know?
Okay.
And actually, if you read in the transactions with the spirits, when he and his family and Kelly and his family go to the continent to try to get some work from Rudolph, Emperor Rudolph, he goes to Catholic mass. He goes to confession with Catholic priests.
Interesting. Okay.
He has no problem with that, and I think Dee's project, and probably, you know, it's such a mess. You know, so many things that would, if they had happened differently. Like what was the Cardinal Robert? What was his name? So during Elizabeth's time, if the Archbishop of the Catholic Archbishop of Canterbury, or Robert, whatever his name was. You know,
There's Matthew Parker, and then there's but these are later guys. Matthew Parker, then Andrew
Rob,
Whitgift. You're probably thinking earlier than
Robert Powell or something like that.
that. Okay,
But he almost was Pope.
interesting.
And if he would have become Pope, it would have changed history.
Okay,
You know, it's like all these weird accidents that happen in England, right? Where Edward dies at however old he was, 20.
okay,
And then Mary's in there for a little, she dies. Elizabeth, who wasn't even supposed to be there, ends up as queen, rules for 45 years. And she, you know, like her father, I think, she was politically Protestant, but I think personally Catholic,
right,
you know.
right,
And I think, you know, just like the Via Media, the middle way of the Anglican Church. I mean, when, you know, most people, if they were going to an Anglican church and didn't know, they would probably suspect it was a Catholic church. Because it certainly looks, I did when I was a kid and I went to a wedding in an Anglican church. I thought it was a Catholic church.
Yep.
And I was Catholic. You know, it's like, it looks like what we do, right?
right.
But I think Dee's project was actually to unite the wounds of Christendom.
Okay,
That was his project, his great with the language and everything, was to fix that.
interesting.
You know, and that was I think that was his bigger project than just the British Empire.
Okay, would you say that maybe Shakespeare's also attempting that project?
I would, because he's not picking sides, right? And he's much more sympathetic to the Catholic. I mean, look at how many Catholic characters are in his plays. Not just talk about priests and stuff, but Romeo and Juliet. I mean, how many of the plays take place in a Catholic country or in a Catholic context? Right. And like as I said, the weird thing is that the Catholic prelates are not stock villains in his plays, except for in not Henry V, but certainly in, you get a little bit of that in Henry VI.
Yeah.
With the stuff with Joan of Arc, right?
Right.
But that was an earliest play. That was an earlier play for him, so he was trying to make good with the people, with the authorities.
Right, and those could be those are still up for argument for being co-written as well, and so many of those passages could be Green or Marlowe or Kidd or somebody.
Yep.
That may be more likely to have Catholic sympathy or anti-Catholic sympathies.
Antipathies, yeah.
Yep. Let me see. I'll let you take over.
Yeah, well, we're approaching almost to the hour and a half mark. I don't know how much longer you have left. Wait, what'd you say?
Are we really? I had no idea. It's been so much fun. I didn't think it was just getting started.
Yeah, I was gonna say that usually I see your videos, and most of your videos are during the daytime, so I was like, oh no, I don't want to run them out to where it's like nighttime over there. But yeah, I don't know. Yeah, you can just I've got a few more questions left.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, maybe another, at most half an hour or something, So, alrighty. Well, yeah, just to kind of, I don't know where I want to take this. Well, I'm still on this sort of, one of these things that you also talked about in the video that I've talked about since the top of this video is the magician state, and I'm still just trying to qualify, trying to judge how I feel about Shakespeare, because obviously I think it's great language, and it feels, I hate to use this word because it can kind of sound dirty to someone, but it feels like it gives you power when you can kind of actually understand what it's trying to say, or some of the conversation. It can kind of be sort of mentally liberating, but at the same time, I'm gonna have a wacky take here. I know you're familiar with Frances Yates. I don't know if you've read her Theater of the World before.
I have.
But when I think about, and I made this sort of take in a video about magic circles and apocalypsis, because if the Globe Theater is essentially based on Vitruvian architecture styles, which essentially just looks like big giant circles with a bunch of stars imposed in them, I'm like, well, that just looks like a magic sigil to me. And what do we say about loading a bunch of energy or people into a stadium in a place and then having these emotional outbursts? And if we think on a metaphysical layer, you pack a bunch of people into a magic sigil, you make them all bawl or cry at Pericles, or go oorah, at a Henry V play, and I just begin to wonder, how to properly navigate something that I feel is liberating and really cool, but something that also wants to, get in my head.
Well, there's like Stephen Greenblatt and some other people, and they're not my favorite critics, but I think they make a good point that they call it the migration of the holy from the church to the theater, right? And so I think you see that, even before the Reformation with the miracle plays, right? I mean, theater in England kind of starts with miracle plays. Yeah. People putting on parts of the Bible on the back of a wagon, right? But then, one of the big criticisms of the Catholic Church and the Protestant Reformation was that it's all a performance, right? And they're also, and I got into it recently about this with some trad caths and ortho bros who were getting upset about me being about magic, or like I'm a practicing magician or something. And that, but like Catholic and Orthodox liturgies aren't magic. You know what I mean? Why do you make the sign of the cross? Just because we do?
Yeah. Yep.
Did you watch an Exorcist movie? You know what I mean? What's with holy water, right? But I think there is something to be said for that, and there's something mesmerizing with the Orthodox and the traditional Catholic liturgies. You feel lifted out of yourself, and you also feel lifted out of yourself at a good performance in a play. Maybe there's a different energy attached to it, but you don't go there to feel either place to feel the same way you felt when you walked in. You go into those places wanting to be elevated. Whether you consciously conceptualize that or not. That's why people go to those things, because they want an experience that lifts them out of themselves, that imparts meaning to them, right?
Right, and I think there's maybe something to say about how both, like, they're so able to get to that sort of trance state because the participants in that are so passively participating. It's this active passive participation where you are actively engaging your imagination with the world, but there is not really this level of social physical interaction, yet that's somehow in context or relation with this publicness of it, that each person's having that own kind of individual experience while seeing everybody else maybe mirroring that same,
And both are so reliant on word and image too, right?
Right.
That's the magic.
Right. Okay.
That's why in the Protestant Reformation, I mean, especially the more extreme Calvinist iterations of it, they just wanted no images, right? No symbolism, no candles, no flowers, no nothing, right?
Right.
Just keep it austere, because all those things are lures, which is what you see in you see a little bit in Milton and Paradise Lost, but even more in The Fairy Queen, which I hate. But The Fairy Queen, I mean, Spencer was I think Spencer was a great poet, but that's talk about propaganda, right? Right. He's got that whole thing going on in The Fairy Queen, where he's building a seductive scene, and you're kind of getting drawn in as a reader, and he's like, aha, look at how sinfully you are. You're falling for that, right? You mean you're doing? Yeah, you're playing me. Yeah.
Oh, that's great.
So go burn some Catholics. Yeah, in Ireland.
No kidding. And no, that all sort of makes sense and checks out. It's hard to navigate this space, like Brady said, where we want to be so careful and guarded against sort of forces and powers and entities that we don't quite fully understand, whether you want to call it magic or just psychological effects if you're some materialist out there. Either way, we guard against it, but yet, like, if you guard too much against it, you become like these Puritans, right? You become these austere type people that, like, okay, no, art is dead, there is no such thing as art, kill the idols,
right?
And it's interesting, like, I think in a large part because of that, Protestant churches don't have this outlet for art, and that does sort of drive people towards things like theater. So I can totally buy into what
Well, and
Greenblatt's
that's
saying
why
there.
they also, I mean, in late iterations of Protestantism, I mean, you look at the churches that once lambasted the Catholic Church for being theater. Now they have a stage and a praise band, right? I mean, come on, guys, right? But that's what happens is, it's going to get in the back door,
Right.
right? And in fact, there's a really great book that came out maybe 15 or 20 years ago by Brad Gregory called
Okay.
The Unintended Reformation.
Okay.
And his take, and I think he's right, is that the Reformation, with all the iconoclasm that went with it and everything else, created materialism in Western society.
Secular art, right? Yeah.
It's kind of an extrapolation on what's the Protestant work ethic guy. What was that? I have a brain fart right now, but the idea that that's what, and you see it in Johnson's critiques of the Puritans.
Daniel
right?
Defoe, is that the one you're thinking?
No, not Daniel Defoe.
Okay, sorry.
It'll come back to me. But in Johnson's plays, he's ripping on the Puritans as hypocrites because all they really care about is money, right?
Right.
But they act like they're the saints at the same time.
Right.
But eventually, without the mystery, because the world is inhabited by mystery, whether you admit it or not.
Right.
And if you try to ignore it, it just, I think that's what we saw with COVID and with the magical operations that were going on then. You had magical operations working on people who primarily don't think magic exists. And that's cool with those guys, right? That's all right. That makes our job easier, right?
Right.
And I think a lot of that you can lay on the of the Protestant Reformation. It made magical operations easier because that way you don't even looking for them.
Right. Yes.
And also your own. And I think the thing is, with having an atrophied imagination, you don't have the tools to fight against it. Right? You don't have you call it the white magic if you want to resist it.
Right. The sort of white blood cells,
Yeah.
your immune system to it. Yeah.
Yep, exactly.
And that's why I think John Michael Greer is so important.
Yeah.
Because he and I are the same age. I mean, I've talked to him in an interview format before, but he's a guy I'd like to hang out with. Because I think we have a lot in common.
Totally would see that. And, some of us might pay to watch y'all hang out. So
and the thing is, he's got a great sense of humor, too.
He's funny. He's dry.
I think it's just because of our generation, but the other person I really would love to hang out for the same reasons is Kenneth Branagh.
Oh, okay.
Kenneth Branagh is about the same age,
yeah,
as John and myself. So, and both of those guys, I totally get their sense of humor. I think it's generational.
I guess Brady and I are probably not absolutely representative of our generation, but I love y'all's generation's humor, and everybody makes fun of me because I don't watch any movies past a certain year, which is 2008. And I predominantly watch movies from the 40s through 70s.
That's what I do too.
And so would love to see that happen if that could happen down the line. I don't know if Kenneth will show up, but if you and John could do another
be a little tougher.
podcast talk, that would be awesome.
Boost the signal. Stop it on there.
Let me see. Here you go, Brady.
All right. Let's see. Yeah, I'm covering a lot of good ground here. How was I gonna? I had a way of circling back on something. I was gonna bring up. We talked a little bit about Spencer. I was gonna ask if you had any knowledge, and it's kind of a wild curveball, but anything to do with like King Arthur or perhaps like the Holy Grail, or if any of this sort of stuff integrates into a later Renaissance period or anything like that.
Well, that's the one thing people always say is like, why didn't Shakespeare write a play about Arthur, right? When it seemed like the perfect thing, especially. Well, I think the reason some people have given is because Henry's brother, who was supposed to be king, his name was Arthur. So it would have been bad mojo suggesting Arthur should have been the king, not Henry, right? But it's interesting. I mean, I think it's, to me, I mean, personally, the Morte d'Arthur is probably the most meaningful book on my bookshelf because I think it describes so much of how the reality of the world is.
Interesting.
I mean, I'm a big Parsifal fan, Wolfram and the Chrétien versions, but for some reason, the older I get, the more d'Arthur, because in the Morte d'Arthur, right, the problem is it doesn't work out, right? It's doomed from the beginning, yet and there's still, even at the end, right, there's still the Rex Futurum, right? Rex Quandam, Rexque Futurum, the once and future king, the promise of the once and future king. But it's so sad the way it ends in such disaster for everybody. It's something that had so much hope in the beginning, right? And I think that, and I think, I often think that the problems I see in Christianity, in particular the Catholic Church in which I grew up right now, I've actually used the term the once and future church, and actually recently in my Substack, because I think if I look at the world as it is right now with governments and all the institutions, colleges, universities that we can no longer trust, they were rotten from the inside for a long time, and now we can see it. That there's kind of only the hope for a once and future, whatever that is,
Right.
I like that. And I think the Morte d'Arthur really describes reality, and it was written by Mallory, or put together, compiled, or edited, however you want to put it, by Mallory while he was in prison.
Right.
And he was bummed out that because he saw the age of the knights coming to an end. Right. And it's so to me, it's just more I think about it, it's more and more compelling that it describes our situation right now in the West perfectly.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm so personally prone to those sort of swan song narratives. So, whether it's Gone with the Wind or something like Fear and Loathing of Las Vegas for, what the 60s were. I absolutely am totally obsessed with that kind of death of an age type narrative. And there's something so powerful about something being written in that time, like not necessarily Gone with the Wind, but definitely Fear and Loathing. It's somebody with a firsthand vision of the death of the scene. And, I don't know. Walt Whitman himself says that Shakespeare is personally very aligned to that sort of Mallory type disposition, that Shakespeare is a little more prone to the longing to a more feudalistic past, longing for traditional chivalric knighthood, all those sorts of things. And so it's interesting that you bring up Mallory. That's something that hasn't been on my radar, but I'm going to start putting it on my radar.
Well, and I think with Shakespeare, I used to tell people, I said, the last person you want to be in the world is a king in a Shakespeare play, right? Because they're all fucked. It's never good, right? And but which in Shakespeare, the joy is in the countryside, right? In so many of the plays, in The Winter's Tale.
Yeah.
And
the Forest of Arden, right?
Yeah, the Forest of Arden.
Right.
And the people, the people have made jokes basically that, if Romeo had run away to the forest, not to a city, they'd both be alive today. Right?
There's like beyond a grain of truth to that, right?
Yeah. And I think that would come from, and I think And for me personally, the things that give me hope right now are not the institutions and the governments, but and not just what's going on right now, but through history is those kind of folk traditions
Right.
that Shakespeare celebrates. He makes fun of them too, right?
Right.
But he celebrates them in the way he, just like my patron saint Robert Herrick,
Okay.
who I think is underappreciated poet, and he's like my godfather. I love him to death.
Okay.
But he celebrates those that folk traditions, that folk Christianity. But he also makes fun of the people at the parish at the same time, right? Which is
Right.
what Shakespeare does.
Right.
And so I think when I see those kinds of, and I think that's my attraction for John Michael Greer, because I think in the kind of paganism that he practices is also, and I think what people are missing in the Christian world is the connection to the agricultural year, which was there for the longest time, and with modernity, the Christian year became kind of divorced from the cosmos, and I think that's enormously damaging. I think that spells the death knell for Christianity,
Right.
and unless it can be somehow connected back to the cosmic year, I mean, which is the agricultural year,
Right.
I don't see it surviving.
Right.
Because what's going to be connected to,
Yeah.
the internet?
Right. Right. Yeah. It's just like a floating island of mandrakes at that point. It's not. It's gonna wander until it withers, and that's it. And that you're absolutely spot on. That there's this deep grassroots sort of feeling in. I wouldn't say just Shakespeare. I'd say a lot of the literature that era, like you're saying with Herring. He's part of the school of Ben, if I'm correct, right?
Yes, you're right.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so like there is, I don't know.
But it's also magical too. It's not just grassroots.
Right.
There's a spiritual or magical dimension to it.
Right.
That is life-giving.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And this is something that we talked with John Michael Greer about, that like we would like to have some sort of return to this, without all the sort of patriarchal Western Eurocentric baggage, but some kind of return to worldviews that were more akin to these medieval Renaissance worldviews.
Yeah. Well, we do a lot of that on our farm. So, in fact, last night we were celebrating St. John's Eve. So we're jumping over the fire and drinking. What was I drinking? I was drinking elderberry liqueur, or elderflower liqueur.
There you go.
That made elderflowers on our farm.
Okay.
And we do May Day. We have the maypole dance here and stuff, and we celebrate Michaelmas. We celebrate the 12 days of Christmas.
Okay.
Because the thing is, you can't wait for other people to do it.
Right.
And I think that the problem for me for most of my adult life was I was waiting for other people. I would see stuff like that. So people should do that. But it was like the Holy Spirit going, "Yeah, dummy, you should." So we started doing it all, and it's enormously life-giving.
That's awesome.
And it's fun. You know what I mean?
Right. Brady, I know you.
I think my kids would love to jump over the fire. I don't think I've introduced that concept to them. This guy on the internet told me
don't
to do it.
Don't put it on Facebook. So like 10 years ago, my two youngest, I have 9 kids, but my two youngest are 14 and 16 now. So 10 years ago, they were, when we first moved, they were probably 5 or 6. and so we were having them jump over the fire. We put it on Facebook, and a bunch of my wife's relatives, "I don't think you should be doing that with children. They could catch fire and everything." Are they going to report us?
Yeah,
right?
CPS come knocking on the door.
Yeah.
That's great.
Well, I think we're kind of winding down here. I think I'm actually going to run out of questions before we run out of time, maybe. But I chance kind of missed here at the very beginning. Michael had mentioned that he was a professional guitarist for a long time. So I was just going to ask you, name some of your favorite guitarists, and I don't know if you have any affinity.
I got a lot of them. Depends, but I can. Paul Simon is a great guitar player that nobody appreciates,
Okay.
and so is Lindsey Buckingham.
Okay.
In fact, I was in a band. Get this, back in the
Let's see,
day,
Lindsey
before I quit the band. Our manager was trying to get Lindsey Buckingham to produce an album by us.
Oh wow.
And I was a little stoked, but he's a great guitar player. I'm kind of glad it didn't happen because I would have been too intimidated to play the guitar. I certainly like Jimmy Page,
Yeah, yeah.
Richard Thompson.
Okay.
I mean, there's all kinds of them that I like, and I think those are the ones I kind of circle back to.
Okay.
Dougie MacLean, I don't know if you know who he is, the Scottish folk singer. He's a great guitar player.
Okay.
Really like him.
Okay.
But
very cool.
those are some of my main ones, I guess.
Very cool. Thank you for that.
Well, yeah, you mentioned Lindsey Buckingham because I was going to ask. Peter Green is another inside joke over here for me and Chance. And so, yeah, you mentioned Buckingham, who obviously he's in Fleetwood Mac, and Peter Green founds Fleetwood Mac. So we made it there, I guess.
Close enough.
Yeah, yeah.
But actually, so way back in the day, let me see, who was it? So last summer I played a gig. I came out of retirement to play a gig with some of my friends, but our bass player was Don Was.
Okay.
From, you know who Don Was, the producer, is?
No.
Oh yeah, you look him up. Don Was. He produced so many songs that were gigantic. He produces the Rolling Stones and Bob Dylan, and Love Shack was one of his. I mean,
wow.
Lyle Lovett. I mean, everybody. He's got so many gold records. Nicest guy in the world, but he played bass, which was fun. It was his gig. He called us. But when I was 22 or 23, I was at this bar on a jam night because my friends were running a jam night, and the lead singer from the MC5 walked in. I don't know if you know who the MC5 was, like the proto punk band ever, and so I talked myself on stage to play with him, which was a highlight of my career.
Wow.
So I get to play like Wayne. So when I was a kid, Wayne Kramer was one of my favorite guitar players.
Okay. Wow.
And you know else is really good, and I don't think he gets enough credit for being a great guitar player, is Peter Frampton.
Okay.
His guitar playing is amazing, even when he was a kid. I mean, his songs are always lame. You know what I mean? I don't think he's a great songwriter, but his guitar playing is just like it's very Django Reinhardt influenced.
It's funny. You're hitting all the right names. My roommate's a semi-professional guitarist, and he's, his whole life Paul Simon was the god. There's Bob Dylan and the Beatles and other stuff like that, but Paul Simon was his god, and then he got an electric guitar in college, and then Jimmy Page became the other god. And it's funny. I've been trying to push Frampton on him because he's in a Boston cover band, and I've been trying to say, hey, you guys need. They have a whole set of non-Boston songs, and hey, you guys got to do some Frampton so you can show off your guitar. And yeah.
You can even do the Humble Pie song. I don't need no doctor. If you know that one.
Okay.
Where Frampton was, I think, 17 or 18, and just. I hate guys that good.
Yeah. That era is littered with people like that, and it drives me nuts. I heard on an XM radio that Peter Frampton one time went to jam with Peter Green, and they didn't have any chords for their amps. They had forgotten their chords, and so what they did was they took a bookshelf and took all the books off, flipped it on its side, and then set the guitars on top of the bookshelf.
Yeah, really, to amplify it.
And it would amplify the electric guitar noise, and they jammed like that for like an hour.
Good for them.
Yeah. But I did not realize you were a guitarist. I could sit here and pick your brain on that because I'm a big aficionado, and so I'm glad Brady brought that up. But one thing I want to ask you before we let you go, we're going to shift right back to Renaissance and Jacobean literature. How do you feel about, someone asked me the other day, who is the best poet ever? And, it's a loaded question. I get it. But, I maybe want to ask you before I said my answer. But, yeah, who is the best?
Well, I mean, I have, a handful that I go to again and again.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm a big guy in the metaphysical poets.
Mm-hmm.
But John Donne
Yeah, that's
is
who I said.
like
Okay.
John Donne. You read him, you're like, you read Donne, and you're like, wow, this guy's like a super collider.
Yeah.
You know, he just because the thing is, that's why I don't think Henry Vaughan, great, one of my, personally feel very close to him. Same with Thomas Traherne, George Herbert, I love, but without John Donne, those guys don't exist.
Right.
And he just kind of he was like Heidegger. He hit the reset button on poetry.
Yeah.
And I think later William Blake did a similar thing, and also so did Yeats. Well, when I used to teach intro to literature in college, I kept making jokes to my colleagues. I said, I'm just going to change the name of this course to Yeats, because that's all I want to talk about is how good he was.
That's fantastic. And so yeah, I like literally set you up because I was wondering if you'd say John Donne, because that was my answer to the person at that time. And I'm
and one of my chapters in this is on him.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And so like, I'm super partial to some of the 19th century folks like, Whitman or Gerard Manley Hopkins, going into the 20th century. I think the world of Elizabeth Bishop, like her poetry is just the coolest, wackiest stuff there is. But there's nothing like John Donne's Holy Sonnets. Like there just isn't. And
to me, he throws things at each other and creates new elements, like a super collider, right?
Right.
And I think another person who does that in 20th century, he doesn't hit all the time, but when he hits, is Dylan Thomas.
Yep. Okay.
Yeah.
Very, very much agree with that. Super agree with that. Another one that I think really highly of is James Dickey, who I guess.
Me too.
Okay. Really? Okay.
Oh
cool,
yeah, I
cool,
love
cool.
James Dickey.
Yeah, I love James Dickey's poetry. It's.
He's got a similar thing going on, and he's very inventive with his forms too.
Yes.
Yeah.
And somehow it always feels organic, and I don't know, love it. So yeah.
I used to have him right next to my desk right here, where the books went. But James Dickey is something else. I also really like Detroit poet. Maybe you don't know him. Philip Levine.
That sounds familiar.
He's really, I think you would like, if you like Dickey, you'd probably like Philip Levine.
Okay.
Very working class poet, but there's a lot of transcendence to it at the same time.
Okay. I will definitely check that out. Thank you for that, Philip
Sure.
Levine. Yeah. Here, I'll turn it over to Brady, and he can close us out.
Yeah, well, I think that's the end of my list for tonight. I know I've written more down for maybe another time that I'll expand on if we get down there. But I just wanted to reiterate and say thanks again for hopping on and talking to us, and super fun conversation.
Hey, thank you. The time went by like nothing, so thank you.
Yeah, well, great. Well, I will definitely be in touch, and thanks once again. I guess we'll end it here.
God bless. Take care.
Hey,
Thanks,
likewise.
Michael.
Hey, bye-bye.